Welcome to the Cities at Tufts colloquium. Along with our partners Shareable and the Kresge Foundation, and more recently the Barr Foundation, I'm Professor Julian Adjaman, and together with my research assistants Perry Scheinbaum and Caitlin McLennan, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognises Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Kian Goh. Kian is Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at UCLA, and she's Associate Faculty Director of the UCLA Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy. She researches urban design, urban ecological design, spatial politics, and social mobilization in the context of climate change and global urbanization. Kian's current work investigates the spatial politics of urban climate change responses with fieldwork sites in North America, Southeast Asia, and Europe. As a professional architect, she co-founded the design firm Super Interesting and has practiced with Weiss, Manfredi, and MV-RDV. She received her PhD in urban and environmental planning from MIT and has a Master of Architecture from Yale. Today, Kian is going to speak about her book, her new book, Form and Flow, The Spatial Politics of Urban Resilience and Climate Justice, which came out, I think, in the last month from MIT Press. And the book looks at the politics of climate change response strategies in 3 cities and the mobilization of grassroots activists to fight the perceived injustices and oversights of these plans. So her talk today is From Urban Resilience to Climate Justice. Kian, a Zoom-tastic welcome to the Cities at Tufts colloquium. As usual, please, microphones off and video off, and send your questions through the chat function. Kian.
Thank you, Julian. Wow, such an amazing introduction. I really appreciate this. Thrilled to be here. First, thank you, Julian. It's an honor to be able to do this. Thank you, Perry and Caitlin. So happy to be here. And so because you've done such an awesome introduction, I'm actually going to cut to the chase a bit in my talk. So I'm going to share my screen right now and go straight to the context without too much of the preamble so that we have more time for conversation later. So I'm going to give some context and then talk about two main points from the book, and then leave with 2 implications of what I found. So first, to start with the context, in October 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit the New York City region. The storm made vivid the vulnerability of the metropolitan region to climate change-related disasters. In its wake, attention has focused on Rebuild by Design, a competition led by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development and funded in large part by the Rockefeller Foundation. And its objective is to find innovative design and funding mechanisms to protect the city from stronger storms and sea level rise. On the left, one of the 6 winning proposals by by the team led by architecture firm BIG for Lower Manhattan. And at the same time, Sandy exposed the unequal impacts of disaster and recovery, what researchers have called a tale of 2 Sandys. Grassroots recovery efforts by community organizations and movements like Occupy Sandy on the right have been well noted, but their influence on municipal and state projects have been limited. In January 2013, just weeks later and halfway around the world, massive storms once again hit Jakarta, Indonesia. And the floods called attention to the predicament of the city, considered one of the most vulnerable to climate change, with its failing infrastructure compounded by acute social and environmental inequities. In response to this most recent flood, city officials, backed by international consultants, proposed what's called the Giant Seawall Master Plan. You see it on the left. And it is in itself a new city for 1.5 million people to be built on reclaimed land in the Jakarta Bay. From the air, it is shaped like the great Garuda, the mythical bird that is the national symbol for Indonesia. And the master plan comes alongside efforts to evict poor urban residents living in informal kampung settlements along coastlines and river edges. So some of the urban poor have resisted, organizing and proposing counter plans to business as usual displacement. So New York and Jakarta are distinct and very different cities, and these two events might be considered isolated, linked only by timing and too much water too fast. But in specific ways, they occurred not only in parallel to each other, but also in relation to each other. The disasters prompted ambitious plans in both cities, launching each towards what would be a significantly different urban future. The events and responses also expose persistent social and spatial inequities in both cities, long-time patterns of marginalization that were accentuated in the wake of the disasters and at risk of being entrenched in the future plans. So in both cities, community groups on the ground mobilized in response to the injustices and oversights of the prominent plans. These cities were caught up in intersecting moments, transformative environmental and political change on global and local levels, and shifting ideas about the present and future of cities. So in my book, Form and Flow, I explore how in their interconnections with another city, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, they reveal the emerging dynamics of global and urban environmental struggles. So on the one hand, a new wave of large-scale urban interventions around climate change, driven by environmental urgency, urban development pressures, and global networks of expertise, mobilized towards new modes of capital accumulation in the face of environmental catastrophe. On the other hand, social movements rising in response to historical and present-day injustices, often harnessing for themselves the power, the tools and the strategies of professionalized planning and design, and the power of networks. These initiatives, plans, and counterplans represent contested visions in response to social and environmental challenges with different, often oppositional priorities, methods, and objectives. They bring to light institutional power relationships, international relations, the histories and geographies of marginalization, systemic oppressions of race and class, and the political economy of place. So really urban spatial politics in this new context of global environmental change. New York, Jakarta, and Rotterdam are exemplary of these new globally constituted and locally contested urban responses. But I argue that they represent an increasingly general condition, the interconnected social, spatial, and environmental conflicts and motivations that now affect cities all around the world. So in the face of all this, I ask, in the face of climate change and uneven social and spatial urban development, how are contesting visions of the future produced and how do they attain power? So my research takes place in a particular context of cities and climate change. First, the emergence of urban resilience as a primary theme in discussions of climate change planning. Resilience is celebrated usually as a positive characteristic of people and places to, in quotes, bounce back from shocks and stresses. But it is critiqued for its vagueness and for the ways in which it promotes and protects status quo socioeconomic systems. Like bounce back to what? the kinds of conditions that got us into this problem in the first place often. So second, the emergence of a global climate justice movement. And this movement builds on foundations of environmental justice, but in my view, it really dislocates the scales and temporalities of what has normally been place-based and locally specific notions of justice to broader global systems and to both immediate and longer-term world historical periods. At its core, the climate justice movement gains strength from community-based struggles, including fights for lives and livelihoods among farmers, fisher folks, and the rights of indigenous groups. But it is shaped through multi-scalar, multi-level frameworks and networks, through the actions of widely dispersed institutions and activist groups. And because of the structures of formation and the modes of organizing of this movement, I think it has really important implications for urban space, climate change, and justice. Although we see these emerging dynamics, scholarship on urban climate change responses has too often tended to reinforce the divisions between spatial and social, drawing a line between hard engineered infrastructure, for example, and measures that are more social and political in focus. These studies have also tended to assume urban politics to be cohesive and contained, and they have relied on static conceptualizations of the city as a bounded and knowable territory. So these leaves out not just the relationships between, for instance, a municipal entity in the urban region, but as well the interconnectedness of social and spatial relationships across networks, as well as broader processes of urbanization. So in my research, I set out to counter these dominant discourses. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to note, I ground my research in theories that explain spatial and social power relationships in the urban, including the social production of space, urbanization and uneven development, spatial justice, and the geographies of policy mobility. And I also looked to theories that explain the interrelationships between social, ecological, and technological processes in and through cities. So I'm going to talk about two threads of this research. Let me just check the chat just in case there's anything for me. Okay, no, great. So first thread, how is this new wave of planning conceptualized? Who's behind the plans and who stands to benefit? One remarkable thing about this story, and increasingly others like it, is the role of the Dutch. Here we see then Dutch Infrastructure Minister Melanie Schultz with HUD Secretary Sean Donovan on the right here, signing a memorandum of understanding for cooperation between the Netherlands and the United States on sustainable urban development and water management. Minister Schultz again on the left at the announcement of the Jakarta Giant Seawall Masterplan, which was largely funded and authored by Dutch consultants and the Dutch government. The Netherlands has long been held as a beacon for spatial planning and water management, epitomized by large-scale projects, well, large-scale national projects such as the Delta Works. But in the last decade or so, from 2008 onwards, economic liberalization and the global economic crisis led to initiatives to decentralize decision-making and embrace more market-driven approaches to spatial planning and development. In 2008, a new Delta Commission was formed and charged with long-term safety against climate change. In addition to recommending increased protection of the diked areas, the Commission also recommended more flexible responses, including Room for the River, a program to allow occasional localized river flooding. So this new approach to, in quotes, building with nature is still technocratic, but is ecological, a self-described paradigm shift in Dutch spatial and environmental planning. So on one level, many of these new environmental projects are now conceived on a city or local scale. So Rotterdam in particular has developed a really ambitious climate adaptation program. City officials talk up pilot projects such as water squares on the left, recreational spaces that also protect against flooding from cloudbursts. On another level, there's an outward shift, a focus on international relationships. So entities such as Connecting Delta Cities, a network initiated and coordinated by the Rotterdam Climate Program, Deltares, a Dutch hydrological research institute, and the Netherlands Water Partnership, formed to help the Dutch water sector gain greater international impact. They all cooperate to bring opportunities to Dutch firms for projects around the world. And you can see on the right here at the Cities in Times of Climate Change conference in Rotterdam in 2014, Dutch climate and water agencies and water and engineering and infrastructure firms met with delegations from countries around the world, including Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the United States. So here, the interconnections between national and local government, private interests, and international constituents are made explicit. For the Dutch, water management is a key export industry and one in which they hold undeniable pedigree. Climate change has only made more urgent the need for solutions, and the economic crisis at home has further motivated global relationships. So a project like the Giant Seawall in Jakarta serves not only as a venue for continued involvement in Indonesia of these Dutch firms, but also, to quote a Dutch water official or Dutch official, quote, a vehicle for the Dutch sector to show their expertise, to be a credible partner, especially for private investors, a showcase project for the rest of Asian city development, end quote. In Jakarta, the deep involvement of the Netherlands brings up provocative questions. The Giant Seawall Master Plan is paid for by the Dutch government, even though the implementation is meant to be privately funded through real estate development. The primary authors of the plan are Dutch infrastructure and engineering firms, urban designers and landscape architects, and economic development consultants. Minister Schultz, when she unveiled the plan, she said, quote, "We Dutch feel very much at home here. We feel senang," which means at ease. So this in Jakarta, a city that still very much bears the social, spatial, and technological legacy of more than 300 years of Dutch colonialism. Beyond a notion of climate-induced disaster capitalism, it is tempting to see this kind of thing as an example of environmental neocolonialism. But it's also, in my view, not quite as straightforward. So Dutch officials talk about the struggle on their part of proving that they are the ideal long-term partners when Korean and Japanese companies are promising solutions for less money. The international relationships that are being fostered are not only with so-called developing countries. Many of the firms associated with Dutch adaptation are also involved in Rebuild by Design in New York. One of the principles of the principle of Rebuild by Design is Henk Ovink, former Dutch Director of Spatial Planning and Water Affairs. And 4 of the 6 winning teams of this initiative have substantial Dutch involvement. So what do we find? Take, to begin, a more static view of the relationship between nation states and cities. What we see, in fact, is a multi-scalar, multi-level network through which the diffusion of capital, knowledge, and influence takes place. What's notable are the ways in which national strategy, here the Netherlands, is operationalized through cities. Urban networks like connecting Delta cities and entities such as Deltares are part of new relationships that really start to pull the global and the urban together. And I think this is important in light of prevalent and continuing discussions in planning that stress and, in my view, overstress the centrality of cities as the focus of solutions. This focus on the city leaves out a huge part of the motivation. The rhetoric and reality of our climate crisis opens new avenues of exchange, and these networks and entities play critical roles in bridging scales and political boundaries. Thread 2. So what happens when globally constituted plans hit the ground in particular places? The giant seawall plan, master plan in Jakarta is pretty ingenious. Flooding in Jakarta comes from two sources, from the sea and from the rivers, particularly during heavy rains. The city itself is sinking rapidly due to land subsidence caused by groundwater overpumping, far faster than sea levels are rising. Clogged canals and rivers, as well as decreased land permeability, add to the drainage issues. So the giant seawall encloses and creates two large retention lakes between the current water edge and the new outer seawall. And the plan is that these lakes can be pumped low enough so that the rivers and canals can drain into it. So although this plan is often talked about by researchers and policymakers and also the media as a sea level rise plan, it is really a sinking city plan. It is also a project for which the symbolic and formal nature of the project rivals its infrastructural ambitions. Renderings by Rotterdam-based urban design and landscape architecture firm Kuiper Companions depict the city seawall as a bright bird with open wings protecting the dark city behind it. References to the also winged Brasilia and the feeling that this is a kind of happier, softer version of utopian modernism are hard to shake. And the renderings really present this idea of an idealized society living through the transition of environmental change with prosperity, recreation, and urban nature on the other side. Discussions of the design of this great Garuda plan are quite revealing. Design for engineers and hydrologists comes after the engineering, after the key decisions are already made. But the designer himself speaks about trashing his hotel room in Jakarta, covering the walls with large sheets of paper and going at it freehand. So it's really back to basics, urban designer as rock star. Still, designer Van den Bomen strongly emphasizes the necessity of local stakeholders in Indonesia to embrace the giant seawall. So for him, it is critical for it to be an Indonesian project. He says, quote, "Our role was to capture the technical processes and integrally shape them in such a way that the people of Jakarta, our counterparts in the process, could become enthusiastic about the initiative," end quote. Deltares hydrologist Kees Bond says it best: the Garuda design turned, quote, "a Dutch development aid project, into a national ambition," end quote. But design is also part of the counterplans against these dominating visions. Jakarta residents who are most vulnerable to the floods are those living in the informal kampung settlements along the 13 rivers and the coastline, especially the notorious Ciliwung here. City leaders blame kampung residents for the floods, saying that their actions degrade the water waves while largely turning a blind eye to illegal dumping and rampant and uncontrolled urban development. The giant seawall plan, which counts on clean rivers flowing into the retention ponds, places renewed urgency on projects by the World Bank and Japanese development agency JICA to dredge and widen the canals and rivers. And these projects directly threaten the displacement of kampung settlements. Coalitions of kampung activists have continued to resist eviction and displacement. On the right, you see UPC, the Urban Poor Consortium in North Jakarta. On the left, you see Ciliwung Merdeka, Free Ciliwung, organizing residents from Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo along the Ciliwung in central Jakarta. And both organizations have built coalitions that include researchers, advocates, lawyers, community architects, and students. And they forged working agreements with then City Governor Jokowi for more socially attuned public housing, and as well rehousing within the area for evicted residents. For Ciliwung Merdeka's humanitarian vertical kampung, activists conducted their own community mapping and came out with their own strategies to widen the river, save key landmarks, and reconfigure part of the kampung using a stacked higher density model. So this would allow residents to remain in place and maintain livelihoods and social networks. For these alternate visions, organizers build on real shared struggles, conditions of notoriety, a history of political activism, and the vision and ability to form new coalitions. Design here becomes a platform for political organizing. It makes political vision tangible with documents, numbers, plans to explain and to negotiate. So says Sandiawan Sumardi, an activist with Ciliwung Merdeka, quote, "We proved that a collective planning process with plans and mappings could be made by the community themselves in ways that were concrete," end quote. In Jakarta, these counterplans operate across geographic scales. First, at the scale of the immediate site, where floods and river dredging projects threaten the settlements. Second, the relationship between the dredging projects and broader rules and regulations. So activists compile and disseminate national laws on dredging, reclamation, and landfilling, expanding the boundary of contestation. Third, at a regional scale, the Urban Poor Consortium has developed a network movement across a number of Indonesian cities confronting a diverse set of threats. The strategies of the counterplans also operate through networks. So UPC on one level functions as a network of local organizers across a set of Indonesian cities, but on another level, it forms networks across disciplines with architects and academic researchers. Through its close relationship with RUJA, an urban research organization, it links to an extensive network of Indonesian and international scholars and activists. And in fact, this is how I was able to land and enter and do my research. So this kind of counter network presents a new way of thinking about reflexive modes of resistance. So I'll offer a quick parallel about New York. Rebuild by design was indeed innovative. So, we need to remind ourselves this is not a typical thing, having design for climate change be part of a federally supported program in the US. And it came to be because of timing and the lucky connections, really, between important people, including HUD Secretary Donovan, then Rockefeller Foundation President Judith Rodin, and the aforementioned Henk Ovink. So we see here New York's version of that kind of idealized society post-climate change, a proposal for by landscape architect Scape to build breakwaters out of oysters. According to Oving, Rebuild by Design attempted to bridge two cultures, to merge competition with collaboration and define the common. So this is an ambitious task in the spatial politics of New York City. The Rebuild by Design process was set up in a very particular way, with community development block grants for disaster recovery assigned to local municipalities meant for low-income communities. Teams had to win the backing of local stakeholders in order to win the project. And this resulted in, on the one hand, a more communicative process than one would expect, aligned with what we all say we want. In the Rebuild, the Big U proposal, designers attempted to hybridize Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, meshing top-down and bottom-up, large-scale infrastructure and community relationships. And the stakeholders were initially quite happy with the vision and participation, and they convinced officials to support the big plan. After the competition, each locality assumed control of the procurement process, but already early in the implementation phase, there was conflict over which areas were protected first. So community members in lower income areas in the Lower East Side, the very ones who brought the officials on board, contended that they were not being prioritized, even though their neighborhoods were the hardest hit and the lowest lying. So here, design works to engage communities and win the award, but it's limited by its inability to really change social relationships and political structures. So is there an alternative? I'll bring up one example that I'm very familiar with. So prior to doing my PhD, I worked as an architect in New York, and I designed a community center for the Red Hook Initiative in Red Hook, Brooklyn, an organization that works with youth who live in public housing. And the RHI space here was designed in a collaborative process by and for community. We made a collective sense of ownership a priority. So when Sandy hit, Red Hook, coastal and low-lying, was particularly hard hit, and I was alarmed. The RHI space survived the storm, even though the floodwaters came right up to it. And in the days following, Red Hook emerged as a hub of grassroots recovery efforts. Staff from RHI took the lead, working with Occupy Sandy and other volunteers and city and national agencies. RHI's community Wi-Fi network allowed FEMA to jumpstart its own emergency communications work. And social media posts brought volunteers and donations. The space itself became a recovery command center and soup kitchen. So in Red Hook, community building, social and environmental resilience, and space and design were inextricably intertwined. And it serves as one example of how designers can engage with deeper aspects of justice and equity. So, you know, it's not that one project will change very much, but I would say that this one project is successfully embedded in a broader process of organizing for social and political change. So no one knew that the storm would hit, but the groundwork was laid primarily on this part of RHI staff and constituents who were building these resilient social networks way before the storm. So in the interest of time, I want to finish really quickly. I'm going to skip some things. I know it looks, that last diagram in particular looked cool, but I want to get to one key takeaway following the RHI example. So one of the points of my book was to really take on and reframe some of these problematic notions that we all work with, such as resilience. So can we imagine a more just resilience? Recall how RHI was able to so effectively respond to the chaos after Hurricane Sandy. Jill Eisenhart, RHI's director, describes how important lessons were instilled in their youth constituents well before the storm hit. So quote, before October 29, 2012, we talked about resilience every day. And our definition of it was life will inevitably knock you down. You need to be able to get up again. Resilience is being able to know that you have the strength or knowledge or self-belief or motivation or confidence within yourself to get up and try again. And that you also have a social support network around you that is going to help you when you can't do that for yourself. In other words, end quote, in other words, individual resilience in the face of systemic challenges matters, but more importantly, individuals are part of a collective effort, similarly invested in survival and flourishing, and an effort that is really developed through a history of shared struggle. This is a political notion of resilience born through a distinct theory and practice of change. Further, Eisenhardt emphasizes the place-bound and ground-up nature of this kind of resilience. She explains, speaking about her constituents who are largely public housing residents, quote, a lot of what we're responding to is directly related to the systems and forces and circumstances that are true in this neighborhood. Here, everyone has the same experience with transportation or how long it takes to get anywhere. Everyone has the same experience with the fact that there is no public housing, public high school here, excuse me. Everyone has the same experience that all of the open ball field space is closed so that there's nowhere to go, end quote. She emphasizes the social experiences and the structural forces of a specific geographic boundary and spatial condition. And her words make clear the importance of recognizing social relationships that are part of and in spite of, often, public institutional systems and places. Resilience here is always positional. It is grounded in the historical social relationships emerging from shared struggle against systemic oppression, but is also grounded in the physical spaces, the literal grounds from which such struggle is formed. And such an idea about place-specific, spatially meaningful justice and resilience really opens up for me considerations about how to plan and design for these kinds of spaces. So in this way, a more just resilience broaches new avenues to think about envisioning alternative urban landscapes. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kian. We can de-share your screen for a second.
Yes.
Okay, people, let's get some questions in the chat. I'm going to take my prerogative and get in with the first questions. So, you know, I grew up in a country which, on the east coast of which faces the Netherlands, and we were always in awe of the Dutch in terms of their resolve. They seem to have political consensus, you know, whichever party is in power, water management, the management of the water landscape in the Netherlands comes number one. And it's no coincidence that when we had the big floods in Germany and a lot of people died, and in Belgium, a lot of people died, the Netherlands had floods, but nobody died. And I remember, well, I don't remember the actual time because it was before I was born, but in 1953, they had a great flood in the Netherlands. I think 3,500 people were killed. And the Dutch Prime Minister at the time said, we are going to embark on a program such that no Dutch person will die in floods. And it hasn't happened since. What is it about this tiny nation, which is about the size of Massachusetts, but it's got a much bigger population? What is it about the Netherlands that has given it such prowess?
Great question. Thank you. So I also grew up in a country that borders another country that shares some of these same features. So I grew up in Malaysia, and when I was growing up, we would look at Singapore and as my understanding of planning in cities, came to be, I kept thinking, like, how is it that one country, a small country, is able to take charge so much of its planning, both social and spatial planning, and do things that often the rest of us are like, oh my God, we would like to do that. And I bring that up to say that I think that this kind of position of oftentimes small cities that are, I think, not coincidentally, very much interlinked on a global level, are able to do this. And there's a sense of urgency and threat from small places that are then hooked in to on a historical level to the rest of the world. So for the Netherlands, you bring up the I think 53 or 54 flood that really launched what became the Delta Works to really protect the most populated areas of the country. And I think it's a great point to make, to point an example to point to. I would say that example of the Delta Works it wasn't a whole break, but it comes after about 800 years of growing collective action for security against floods. So, when you look at the history of what has become the Netherlands now, and how they've managed to form water boards from early on in the days to take collective action to drain the bogs and to form land, and then to continually protect themselves against the encroachment of water. This is basically 800 years of social learning that enables a multi-scalar Dutch governmental system to be organized with such trust in the national government and the national priority of security from water. So I think we have to acknowledge that the important thing is we cannot pull the lessons from places like the Netherlands without thinking, do we have parallel examples of social learning in the places that we are attempting to plan for? Or are there different examples, different histories of learning where we could really harness and pull forward plans that might look different from that?
Great point. And so everybody watching, when you look at windmills and you see those beautiful, medieval scenes, maybe the Dutch were planning for climate change right back then in medieval times. So, okay, we got a batch of questions now. Place-specific resilience, how is that different from increasing capacities? MR, can you explain that? It's Megan Tenhoff. Megan, can you explain?
Yeah, so I've been listening to a lot of disaster type podcasts, and there seems to be these two ideas of resilience and increasing individual or community capacity. So that's what I was thinking of when you were saying about the Red Hook initiative. From the way you were describing it, I feel like that was more of an increasing community capacity versus resilience. And so then that kind of goes to my second question sort of here, is increasing capacities more about social and justice focused work versus resilience is investment in hard infrastructures.
Okay, these are interesting points. So firstly, I think it really depends on how you would define resilience. And a lot of the resilience work that has emerged, if you look at some of the more the ones that are held up quite a bit, like by the engineering firm Arab, for instance, they put together a kind of like resilience index, city resilience framework, and they would make the point that resilience is not investment in hard infrastructure only, but that it includes that kind of social capacity building. So they point to a number of different ways in which, you know, we have to take into account the social aspects as well as the hard infrastructure. But I think in the case of Red Hook, what I was trying to point to is that it is not simply a matter of these categorizations that one could arguably make for any place around the world. And in fact, the Arab resilience framework is meant to be operationalizable in any place. But that for RHI and for Red Hook, the particular ability for them to respond to a disaster such as Sandy would emerge out of these the struggle that comes from being in a particular place that they would not have, and a particular place meaning not only in a location in Red Hook, but in a location where most of their constituents are public housing residents. So having to, in many ways, fight against the system to get what they want in a public housing system that actually may well be the best public housing system in the country, but still highly challenged and having faced, you know, a lot of disinvestment in the past. So the history of having to create these social networks within a public housing system that has been disinvested in, as well as facing urban development pressures from outside, like a continual hub of gentrification as well in Red Hook, that they've been able to build a kind of social network that would not have been there if not for the institutional and place-specific nature of the public housing project. I'll pause there. Megan, did I answer that question?
Yes, thank you.
So we got a question here. Could you talk a bit about other sites or cities that could benefit from establishing entities like the Red Hook Initiative? What barriers currently exist on this front?
So I would say, you know, that there are quite a few other places where we do see some examples of this already. So I'll point out, for instance, so Elizabeth Yampier, whom I know Julian knows and is similarly, I think, an admirer of. Elizabeth Yampier is an activist in New York who leads Uprose, an organizing group in, I believe their main area is Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And she points out how her organization and her constituents were able to come together to lead and organize for more ground up and just sustainable policies for New York City. And, you know, I'm not gonna put words in Elizabeth's mouth, but like, I would actually guess that she would critique some of what I've said about Red Hook and point to other things that she and her constituents, her communities have done there. And what they've been able to do that inspires me is to not only from the ground up, but to be able to take part in broader conversations about climate planning and sustainability planning at the level of city government and state government that is quite effective. And in some ways, what we would like to see, ground up community actions that are not only bounded to the locality of that place, but it's able to then build power within like legislative halls in city government or state government. I think it's a So that's one other example. I think it's a particularly, I would say, tantalizing notion at this moment when we have politicians who come from, and I would argue like have come along with movement builders such as your own Michelle Wu in the Boston area, who I think is in a really good position right now to be accountable and to do justice to the community building that, in my view, helped get her there.
Great, thanks. So we got a question from Camille Mins. Camille's one of our students. You've made mention of the colonial relationship between the Netherlands and Indonesia and the conflict of accepting their assistance in these developments. How can that contention be reconciled, if at all? Can it be viewed as a kind of reparative justice process, or is it more of a development aid project, as one of your quotes mentioned?
That's an excellent question. Let me just take a moment to think about this. So I would say first that I think some of it should be a reparative process. And, I think about, for example, what just happened at the UN COP meeting in Glasgow, and how so much of the sticking points about what to do in the immediate aftermath comes down to how much, around the conversations about loss and damage, about how much assistance richer countries who really are the historical cause of the problems we face, how much they're willing to step up and take responsibility for that and help us all do what we want to do. And so I feel like that kind of reparative process should be more part of the kinds of climate change plan making, the globally constituted climate change plan making that we are seeing in places like or between the Netherlands and Indonesia. I would also say, so yes, I think it can be more so. I think it can be framed much more as reparation and not so much as a partnership, because that's usually what is stated. Like, we are partners, but you're like, I mean, yeah, but take more accountability for history. At the same time, I also say that there's large changes happening in countries such as Indonesia, political, economic changes, where I don't think it's fair or useful to deny them the agency of or to neglect the fact that there are power struggles happening on the ground, and that people in Indonesia are trying to figure out what kind of future do we want. Some are actually quite happy with taking aid for sure, and using that aid for large-scale infrastructural projects. And one of the real conflicts about the Jakarta plan is, how do they themselves negotiate the urge, in fact, among some of the high-ranking politicians to say, like, yes, we want this. We want a new modern infrastructure, global infrastructural future. And the organizers on the ground, community activists, who are like, wait, look at what's happening in the kampungs, among the fisher folks along the coastline. Your future doesn't include us. So those struggles also need to be looked at, and they interact with these broader global politics, but they need to be seen along. Both these aspects need to be held in view.
Great. Okay, we've got several more questions, but I just want to ask you one final question, and it's just 1 minute quick answer. In what ways can local government ensure sociological spatial connections of those who are quote unquote disconnected from the grid, like elderly or documented prisoners? How can they be included in climate planning? In 30 seconds.
Yeah, can you wait?
Yeah, so
Say that again.
So Amber, you're in the room, aren't you? Do you want to give Kian your question in a very simple way?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming, by the way. Real quick, how can everybody be included in some of these smart change planning? Yeah. Everybody's not necessarily included, so how can they be included?
That is such a great question. So yes, I think what city leaders need to do, those in power, is not only to like acknowledge and cite the work of organizations such as the Red Hook Initiative, but to take seriously what organizations like this are trying to do. So one example about disconnected from the grid is, you know, in the aftermath of the storm of Sandy in New York, both in Red Hook and in the Lower East Side, some of the most vulnerable were elderly residents who lived on the top floor of public housing projects when the power was out. So they couldn't get out, the elevators were not working. And what these the community groups were able to do is to make sure that they checked in and took care of those who would otherwise be literally disconnected and stranded. And so don't just point out that happened, but in our environmental planning, in our climate change planning, to make sure that we have ways to do that all the time. And also, of course, make sure that, you know, our most like important infrastructure doesn't break down as much as possible, but to fund, to bring on board some of these community organizations more into an institutional setting, not just ask them for focus groups, but to bring them on board into a more cohesive and formal planning structure.
Well, Kian, there's many more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Can we give a warm Cities at Tufts UEP thanks to Kian Goh?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Julian. Thank you. Always great to talk to you. I would love to do it some more. These were such interesting questions. Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Kian. And so no Cities at Tufts colloquium for the next 2 weeks, but on December the 8th, we have Vivek Shandas from Portland State, and his talk is Fahrenheit 911, Heat, Cities, and the Climate Literacy from the Ground Up. And remember, Vivek is the guy that did the work on redlining and heat, showing conclusively that redlined neighborhoods are hotter. So let's all sign up for Vivek's talk. Kian, again, thanks, and we'll speak again soon. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.